Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my AM reading update for mid-December 2023. This is the best I can do. I'm still hoping I can squeeze in 3 AM reading updates, including this one, before the end of the month. We'll see how it goes, and then hopefully in the new year I can go ahead and get myself back on some sort of schedule again. So yeah, this is my first update for December, and as such, I did a whole video where I updated November reading, but I hadn't put up my literary newsletter yet, so I guess I'll go ahead and post that here and now. I write a literary newsletter every month where I summarize a bunch of the literary news that caught my interest. I have snippets of my Goodreads reviews of the books I read that month. I have a book pick. I have book quotes and all that good stuff linked down below. This is my first time of doing, I guess I'll say, incremental monthly updates since October because of NaNoWriMo. I took off November, and so I'm going back to an old tradition where I start each video by reviewing a short story. And where I left off in October, I was still in the middle of reviewing the short stories published in this edition of the Iowa Review from summer 2022. And this week I reviewed the penultimate story called Rabbit by Nikki Ervice. I'm going to guess for that one. Here we have on the opening page, there's actually an actual rabbit photo facing the story, which is so cute. Which makes it kind of awkward when you go into the summary of this story, which is a dual narrative of sorts. It's a story of small-town America, and it begins with a serial killer who is targeting mostly young women and children on the outskirts of society. Our main character is a young middle schooler named Willie, and she and her town are just sort of living with this reality that, and there's no clear evidence of who's doing it, and no clear way to try to stay safe necessarily. Things get kind of weird pretty fast with this one in this storyline where ultimately people start creating life-size dolls of their children and putting them in the window, and then the killer starts breaking into the houses, although it doesn't really feel like a break-in to any of the houses, and he takes or she takes or whatever takes the bodies and the doll bodies and eviscerates it, it's all the stuffing and all of that, and drags the parts down to the lake or what have you. And so there's a complete pivot where instead of human beings being killed, now it's dolls, and there's almost a festive feeling of relief in the town about that, and people kind of want their dolls to be taken, and they start having doll day parties and all of that sort of stuff. And then we get into an alternate storyline where there isn't a serial killer and it's safe to be out in public. And Willie, the main character, kind of decides on her own to start hunting rabbits, although she feels conflicted about it from the start. And even after she feels compelled to do it, there's always a sense of guilt or shame. And usually with most of the rabbits, it lingers a little bit on the suffering of the rabbit, especially if they don't die immediately, which most of them don't. And even with the one that does, there's a lot of, shock and a viscera about it. And she gets, I guess, conflicting opinions from her parents. Her father is this sort of mean alcoholic type figure, and her mother is kind of understood to be a past, beauty queen, kind of innocent. And I think this is a little too out there for me. I guess my assumption is that the message would have to do with the idea of victimhood. First I would think it's a kill or be killed mentality, when it's one storyline, there's this unknown killer killing real people and then the dolls, versus Willie killing the rabbits sort of against her will. But things are just so, obviously surreal and, not something that follows logical conclusions that absurd, I guess is the right word for it, but it's an absurdity that I can't really follow. It's not really for me, which I guess isn't that surprising. I'm mostly a realist reader as it is, so after a while this story kind of went too off the rails and just mostly made me uncomfortable about the poor rabbit. I'll just briefly mention this short story collection, We Love Anderson Cooper, short stories by R.L. Maizes, because in fact I read this in a very granular way for my Hanukkah vlog. I reviewed in detail 8 of the short stories in here, 1 per night in front of my menorah. I'll link to the video down below in case you're interested. In general, I feel a little bit meh about these stories. They're definitely more realist than the story I just read, well, usually, although I felt a lot of the plot points were a little bit contrived, and there's a big focus on humans and bad behavior, I guess is the way to think about it. A lot of the stories are about people who are resentful of one another in some way, and on purpose or by accident, although usually on purpose, seem to sabotage their relationships. Usually there's a lot of good relationships with animals that supersede the relationships with humans, which could be fine so long as you don't go out and, you know, commit psychopathic behavior on humans because of it. To a degree, I liked The Infidelity of Judah Maccabee, which was in fact a Hanukkah short story I read during Hanukkah, and it was about the resentment a man feels toward his wife when she starts bringing her Christmas traditions into the household and the cat starts liking her better. That's like an extra layer on top of it, that he feels betrayed by his cat. But generally speaking, I think it's also, you know, about the realities of interfaith relationships and more relationships than that, perhaps, when people change and bend the rules in ways you didn't foresee when you entered into the relationship. And speaking of pet peeves, the titular story, We Love Anderson Cooper, is about a bar mitzvah gone wrong when a kid awkwardly tries to come out, and it really kind of even when people support him on it, kind of, it mostly, you know, ruins his relationship with his boyfriend. And there's, but the thing that I really disliked about the story, it's just becoming a big pet peeve for me in a lot of fiction, I think, is just how dismissive people are of the bar or bat mitzvah. Like, it's just something you can lazily put in to say this isn't working, and it's just never portrayed accurately, and like, it's just seen as something that, like, just happens on a whim, I think, and rather than something you prepare for a year. And so it just gets, it's a really annoying way to, you know, criticize religion or something when you're not even doing, you know, it accurately. So it's just a big pet peeve. So I feel like this particular story put it over the top for me. So now I know how to look out for that sort of stuff. So I appreciate that, at least. The first 2 novels I finished are actually pretty similar to one another, and I guess I'll start by mentioning Year of Wonders by Geraldine Brooks, which in fact is the first novel she published. So I guess that's an apropos way to start what I hope I will finish this month, which is a read of the rest of her backlist that I haven't gotten to yet, and then I will review this book and the other 2 in a video, an author's backlist video that I'll hopefully be making in January. So anyway, this book takes place during a real plague year in the 17th century, in the 1660s, in a small town in England, and I think, you know, Brooks does this a lot in her fiction where she fictionalizes real events. So this town really existed, and they really did sort of quarantine themselves, you know, barricade themselves from the rest of the world so that, you know, they wouldn't spread the plague. Because and most of the town within the next year died subsequently. And so, you know, it's in retrospect certainly seen as a pretty heroic thing, and probably stopped a lot more death and tragedy. And so in this, we're following a fictional character named Anna, who's this young widow. She loses her husband to a mining accident before anything begins, but it is her house guest who comes in from London, who accidentally brings the plague with him in a way that I think actually corresponds to real history. They think the plague might have arrived within bolts of fabric that this character has delivered because he's a tailor. So we begin with this man dying, and it's tragic because she, Anna, and this man had really were getting along, and he got along well with her children. There's a weird sort of it begins kind of in media res, where it begins after the plague year, and Anna is living with the young minister after his wife had died, and he's this sort of ornery character by this point, and it's just really the two of them against the world. And by that point, you know, almost everyone, including her two children, have died, and I feel like this might be Brooks's way of not making that into shocker value stuff. And you go in and you know almost everyone's going to die, and it feels like, you know, this could be misery porn. And we go into a lot of detail because Anna's the servant of the minister and his wife, and they really put themselves on the front lines to, I mean, the first thing they do is make almost everybody swear in front of God not to leave and to, you know, bring the plague with them elsewhere. And they promise that they'll minister to these people no matter what, as the plague goes on. And so we see a lot of suffering and a lot of death, and I guess it's hard to make that anything more than misery porn, but I feel like, I don't know, I've seen some people compare this to Brooks's coverage of war-torn areas, which it's an interesting comparison, I suppose, because, you know, technically, obviously, this isn't man-made war. This is a biological war, which, you know, nevertheless, like a lot of biological war is more dangerous than anything else. And, you know, as your family sicken and die around you, it's just, you know, devastating in so many ways. And there are ways that the community reacts to this. And Brooks imagines some, you know, man-made horrors sort of in response to this. At one point, some of the family members who had family members die decide to try the midwife as a witch and end up, you know, committing atrocities in that way. And other characters ultimately, as more time goes on and more people die, they turn to extremist, you know, crackpot ways of trying to save themselves, flagellation and selling, you know, quack, you know, remedies and that sort of thing. Even as the minister tries very hard, he's like a really logical, middle-of-the-road man trying to, you know, advocate for what seems like the best course of action in the situation they're in. And Anna's his sort of stalwart, you know, helper that she is just sort of a no-nonsense, no-nonsense, but you know, emotionally empathetic, rational person. And then there's a storyline with Anna's father, who was always a sort of hateful, drunk character, and he ends up taking advantage of the dead. He's a grave digger, and Anna, you know, begs him to help, and he, you know, doesn't seem all that interested. And then he ultimately ends up robbing the dead. I remember I read the Kirkus review. I don't think they liked this book. They thought it was too over the top. All of these developments about how the negative ways that town people reacted and what happened to them, you know, their trials and death and all that stuff. I mean, just on top of the plague. I would say I was doing fine with it. I was doing well with it. I was just invested, I guess, in, there is sort of a surreal feeling of knowing throughout it that no matter who dies, that, you know, Anna and the minister are going to be okay. And then there's this sort of, you know, we get to the point where the wife is about to die, and she's the character who we'd feel the most sympathetic to by that point because she's the most fleshed out. And there's sort of a fake out with her death, that she doesn't die the way that she might seem to, you know, what would seem to be the way she dies the plague, and that's not the way she dies. And it does seem like a bit of a cop-out and over-dramatic. And then the actual ending after the death, which is, I guess just pure spoilery territory. That's the part where I think I agree with people who feel like the ending's a bit too out there, where when Anna leaves the community at long last, she, travels very far away and into a completely different culture. And that's not usual behavior for people in this time period. So it just stood out a little bit. And also, I don't know, the way that things ended up for the minister, I feel like it would have been interesting to maybe stay a little longer in how his grief and just the exhaustion of what he had to deal with might have made him more resentful or ornery, but I don't know. It just was a little too abrupt of a transition. So I do feel like for a while I was really going with this novel, and by the end I was a little more taken out of it. But overall, I thought it was compelling and very sad. And the next novel I read, because it was at the top of my Goodreads list, is The Witchfinder's Sister by Beth Underdown, which also takes place in England roughly 20 years before, during the English Civil War between the King and the Parliament, which is kind of referenced as a past event in the last book as well, particularly when it comes to, the shifting religious norms of the community that, there had been papists, but that papist sort of lifestyle is fading out. And I guess that's a little bit more to the fore here. But again, this is about a specific real life event that the author fictionalizes. This particularly has to do with a man called Matthew Hopkins, who was a self-styled witch hunter, who is responsible for the murder of over 100 women, of trying them and bringing them to court where they'd ultimately be condemned and executed. This novel gives him a fictional sister to try to understand what happened through her perspective, and I guess give the man a little bit of not humanity necessarily, but three-dimensionality maybe. This main character is also an A name, Alice, who had moved to London after a somewhat scandalous marriage to someone of a lower class than herself. Her husband, Joseph, actually gets involved in sort of a militia group involved with churches there, and dies in an accident. Again, this is, during the war, when I guess people are gearing up to fight. He dies in an accidental gunfire accident, basically. And Alice is pregnant with his child, and can only, and is a woman, and so the only place she can go is to her brother Matthew, who is ostensibly, he's like the owner of this inn, but really what he's doing is, well, it takes her a little while to figure out all the details, but he's taking down correspondence for these wealthy landowners in town, and taking down notes about all these condemned women, who, when it comes to witches, as per usual, you look toward people who live on the outside of society, who just don't follow conventional norms, and people who are the objects of beef with some of their more well-established neighbors about, various interactions and that sort of thing. And some of the writing goes, I think, I'm not sure if it's fictionalized or if it's real notes that Hopkins had about interviewing some of these women, where he'd basically tie them up in uncomfortable, contortions of the body, and leave them dangling for hours and ask them about imps coming to suckle them on. Matthew is sort of depicted as someone who truly believes it, unlike everyone else who I think just wants to get rid of undesirables for their land, or because they're, just not comfortable to live around. But Matthew seems to truly believe in devilment. And there is even parts in the story where Matthew and Alice sort of feel things or see things that seem like supernaturally evil. And so Matthew goes the witch way, and Alice never is quite sure what it is, because she slowly begins to realize how, dangerous her brother is, and she has a lot of sympathy for the women, particularly because Matthew has a lot of resentment toward Alice's mother-in-law, because they both knew the mother-in-law because she used to be their mother's servant. And there was backstory with Matthew's a man with scars, and how did that happen when he was a baby, and he has sort of relentlessly pursued a narrative that doesn't seem to be real. It seems like the real narrative is his mother had like a postpartum depression, more or less, and dropped him on accident, but Matthew blames Bridget. And there's this ticking clock about, like, is he going to go after Bridget directly or not? And maybe he's using these other women as a sort of, practice ground for how he could definitively go after Bridget. And there's just this danger in, like, how, in the beginning, Alice is hoping she can still relate to him as her younger brother, and that they could talk and, find empathy together. And it's like a push and pull with him where, you can only get so far with him because he's so stuck in his delusions, and he'll, get angry, but then his biggest weapon is sort of to, suppress his anger and emotions, and it comes out in sort of little violent scares that, in the beginning it's Alice tries to sort of justify in some way or another, because again, she is somewhat beholden to him, especially when, being pregnant and alone in the world. So yeah, in that way, it's about, like, what is she going to do about the situation that gets progressively worse and worse. After a while, he's sent out to go to neighboring villages to, do these, interrogations, if you will, on women that other people have accused, and he drags Alice along with him to those, and it's a sort of that growing sort of suspense novel of, can she get out of this and how, and can she help people and how, as the things are shifting, the walls are closing in around her. In fact, like the other novel I just mentioned, there is an en media res quality where we actually begin at the end and know that Alice is shut up in a room, and like it's too late basically, and she's trying to look back on what happened, and the steps she took, and what was really going on when, she was still in denial about things. So yeah, and again, the ending for this is a little bit out there as well, about how she's ultimately able to get out of this situation. I think for the most part I was really invested, though, in this sort of, slow dive about, like, this sister with limited options trying to deal with a brother who she's slowly realizing sort of the extent of his psychopathy. And also, I guess one thing I will say, we were already on thin ice with, the idea. I mean, I could buy that he was scarred, and the scarring didn't make him a villain. The sort of his self-victimization of himself, and like his reactions to maybe bullying when he was a child, made him into a villain. But there's other parts ultimately that Alice uncovers about Matthew's birth that I feel like kind of goes off the rails again, and that I kind of wish things, like, instead of going into such, dramatic territory for an already dramatic story, I wish Underdown had kind of, made things a little more simple and focused a little more on the psychology without all the even more theatrics. And anyway, I think I'll stop there. As you can tell, it's weird to talk about supernatural things and the light be like this, but I've been rambling on long enough that the light is shifting through my window. So yeah, I'm going to go a lot faster with these next two, not just because of the light, but I generally, I suppose, have a little less to say. I will just continue with my Geraldine Brooks backlist reading. I'm on to her second published book, and the one that won the Pulitzer Prize. This is March, which is technically Little Women fan fiction of a sort that follows Mr. March, who was very much based on Louisa May Alcott's actual father, and his experiences in the Civil War, which technically speaking, I think is so removed from Little Women that it's kind of almost its own thing, you know, because he really wasn't a character, and certainly the antebellum South and fighting there was not something that was happening in Little Women, although certainly the family's response, transcendental responses to slavery and that sort of thing were a part of that book and a part of Mr. March's personality. And so far, I'm only a little ways into this, and it's a split sort of narrative where he's traipsing with his crew through Virginia, and we've already, again, seen a lot of devastation because, you know, the war and the Civil War, there was a lot of death and devastation along the way, and they come across this plantation that they're going to use as like a medical headquarters, and it turns out 20 years before, Mr. March, as a young peddler, had stopped at the plantation when, you know, the people hadn't fled yet. And so he remembers living with them, and in fact, it kind of challenged his sort of beliefs, like staying in this opulent lifestyle with these planters and their slaves, and it ends ignobly when he is secretly trying to teach one of the children how to read, because he's just, you know, he's a wannabe teacher and all of that, and then he's found out and kicked out and that sort of stuff, and now he's back. And so that's where I am so far with this, and I will report back. And finally, before I'm completely blinded here, I am listening to the audiobook Swordcatcher by Cassandra Clare. I first heard about Cassandra Clare's first foray into adult fantasy through an essay she wrote for the Jewish Book Council, where she talked about how her Jewish influences made it into this book, although I don't think this is as ostensibly a Jewish fantasy novel as some of the others I've read recently. But from what she's explained, I can tell which, you know, group in the secondary world corresponds to the Jews. I haven't really gotten there yet. I've just read the prologue, which is it was compelling and fun so far. Definitely much more up my alley than the Shadowhunter books, where this young orphan named Kel is taken from the orphanage sort of abruptly, and obviously in the very beginning he's not, you know, thrilled about it, and he's told by the nobles that he has to stand in a dinner for the crown prince, who he kind of looks like, and you know, just sort of, you know, give off the impression that the prince is fine, but in fact it's an elaborate test. The prince needs someone called a sword catcher who will sort of be like a sworn shield throughout his childhood and then become like a guard. And Kel is swayed away ultimately by Connor and by the fact that he kind of wants to go home and to, you know, back to his friends and that sort of thing. But there's really not much going for him at the orphanage, and like the city they live in, like it mostly seems described by if you're a noble, you live in opulence, and if you're not, things are tough for you. So, you know, he doesn't have much to go back to in terms of a future, whereas to be Prince Connor's bodyguard and friend, and Prince Connor is, unlike his parents, is actually a very charitable, kind sort of guy so far. So he has a future as and he'll have connections with the nobles, and so he decides to go for it, and that's the prologue, and that's as far as I've gotten. And I think, like, he was a young child at this point, and I think we're probably going to jump a little bit past that into the meat of the story, because it is technically adult fiction, so I assume he has to be a little bit older, and so we'll see how it goes, and I'll report back, hopefully, you know, in less dramatic lighting situations. And with that, I think I will take my leave. I will also link to the Cassandra Clare essay I mentioned down below. And in the meantime, we are certainly racing through December, and I hope to squeeze in a Would You Read It challenge video where I look at a BookTube prize ballot of yesteryear. The BookTube prize is this annual prize where we judge the best in literary fiction and nonfiction. In fact, the 2024 season is about to begin at the beginning of the year, but our director Robert is still looking for judges. If you're interested, I'll link to a video down below, and of course talk about it a little more in the next video, so stay tuned for that. I hope everybody is enjoying their reading and everything at the end of the month, and I mean, I personally feel like I'm rushing around a bit. I have a colleague who's on vacation, and just trying to squeeze in a bunch of stuff before the end of the year, so hopefully we'll all make it through, and yeah, thanks so much for watching, everyone. and I'll see you next time.